Christmas Eve settled over northern Montana like a lid, lowering slowly onto a pot that had been boiling all day. By sundown, the sky had turned the color of old steel, and the wind dragged long ribbons of snow across the road that led to the outpost, an emergency wildlife station most people didn't even know existed anymore. Inside Ranger. Ethan Mercer lived in a world measured by gauges and routine. The little heater clicked and sighed like it resented being asked to fight an honest Montana winter. Kerosene lingered faintly in the air, mixed with pine that clung to his coat and boots. A pot of coffee sat on the warming plate, cooked down until it tasted like burnt patience. But it was warm, and warm mattered out here. Ethan stood at the window with a chipped mug in his hand, watching the snow erase the land the way tide water swallows a shoreline. County plows had turned back 10 miles down the mountain. The last headlights had disappeared before twilight finished fading, and after that, the world narrowed to one squat building perched above a dark tree line, a radio mast rising beside it like a lone finger pointing at the sky. He'd spent years learning to read wilderness weather the way some men read faces. Tonight wasn't only cold. Tonight was closing. The wind didn't gust. It pushed. The clouds didn't drift. They held the kind of storm that didn't scream right away. It simply leaned its weight into everything until something gave. The radio crackled with static. Static wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what wasn't there. No holiday check-ins, no bored dispatcher voice, no routine chatter from the nearest ranger district. Silence in this line of work could mean peace, or it could mean isolation so complete that if something happened out here, nobody would know until after it was over. Ethan took a slow sip of coffee and felt the heat slide down his throat like reluctant comfort. He told himself what he always told himself on winter holidays. It's just another night, a date on a calendar. But Christmas Eve had a way of turning memory into weather. It rolled in whether you invited it or not. He moved through his routines anyway because routines were something you could control, and out here control was currency. Generator fuel checked. Emergency lanterns checked. Snowfall rate rising. Satellite phone battery charged. He wrote in the logbook with a pencil worn down to a stub. 18:47. Temp. Falling. Wind sustained. Visibility dropping. He paused, then added another line in the same neat, restrained hand. Holiday. No expected traffic. No expected. The heater popped. The wind lifted. The building made that familiar low creak, like an old ship shifting on its ribs. Ethan listened the way solitude trained you to listen, because if you didn't hear trouble early, trouble introduced itself the hard way. That's when he heard something else. Not wind, not the building settling. A faint scrape. He froze with the pencil still in his hand. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a soft thud against the metal siding, not hard enough to be a branch, not random enough to be debris. Then nothing, just the hush of snow. Ethan set the pencil down as if any sudden movement might change whatever waited outside. He didn't reach for a gun. Not yet. He did what he always did first. He listened. At first there was only the storm. Then after a long stretch of quiet, it came again. A knock, not a rap like a human hand, not frantic, not desperate. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Ethan's throat tightened. His body did what it always did when the world broke pattern. It went still. The knock came again. Metal answering metal, like whoever or whatever was out there understood doors, understood thresholds, understood the idea of asking. He crossed the station without turning on the overhead light. Bright light at night stole your vision and painted you into a silhouette. He moved in the dim glow of the heater, and the desk lamp near the radio steps measured breath quiet. He stopped at the emergency cabinet. His hand hovered near the latch. Inside were tools for different kinds of problems, a flare gun, a bear banger, a locked case with a sidearm. But he didn't open it. Not yet. He went to the door and leaned toward the narrow viewing slit. Outside was a wall of snow and darkness. He could make out only the vague shape of the porch, the wind carving drifts into strange shoulders and ridges. Another knock closer than before, as if the thing outside had shifted its weight. Ethan's mind tried to organize it into something familiar. Lost hiker, broken snowmobile, drunk tourist who ignored closure signs. None of it made sense. Nobody climbed this road in a storm like this. Nobody made it to the outpost by accident. And none of those possibilities explained the rhythm. This wasn't panic. It was patience. Ethan took a breath, felt cold leaking through the seams of the door, and unlocked the outer latch. The bolt, sliding free, sounded too loud in the quiet. He cracked the door an inch. A blade of air knifed into the station, carrying a scent that didn't belong inside any building. Wet fur, cold earth, and something sharp and metallic underneath it. Ethan held still. Outside, just beyond the weak reach of the porch light, stood a shape that made his mind hesitate. Massive, low, breathing hard enough that the air in front of it fogged, disappeared, fogged again like a slow engine. The porch light flickered once, and in that brief stutter of illumination, Ethan saw the curve of a shoulder, the heavy slope of a back, a tawny coat dusted white with snow. Then the head lifted. A lioness, not a mountain lion. Those were lean, narrow shadows with tails. This animal was built differently, like muscle had learned how to become gravity. She stood inches from the threshold as if the concept of distance had stopped mattering. Her ears were pinned back, not in aggression but fatigue. Her eyes were open, steady, strange in the cold light. Golden, but dulled at the edges by exhaustion. And her belly. Her belly hung low, and round the unmistakable shape of a pregnancy carried far along. Ethan's heart hit his ribs hard enough he felt it in his teeth. Instinct surged like an alarm. Close the door, lock it, back away. A lion was not a visitor. A lion was a force. Training ran through his head in clipped sentences. Keep distance, maintain barriers, do not invite a wild predator into enclosed human space, do not corner it, do not remove escape routes. He knew all of that. But the lioness didn't step forward. She didn't bare teeth. She didn't growl. She simply stood there, breath shuddering out of her, a tremor in one foreleg as she tried to hold herself upright. Under the porch light, Ethan saw dark staining along her hindquarters, dried blood or mud, maybe both. He saw a raw strip of fur missing near her back leg skin, angry and swollen. She wasn't hunting. She was enduring. The knock came again, and Ethan realized it wasn't her paw striking like a fist. It was her paw slipping, brushing the metal as she shifted like strength itself was draining out of her joints. Something in Ethan's chest cinched tight. He felt an old argument begin inside him, one he'd lived with for years. If you act and it goes wrong, you own the consequences. If you don't act and it goes wrong, you still own the consequences. He stared at the lioness, and for a moment he wasn't 46 at a Montana outpost. He was younger in a different winter, hearing a family over a radio that kept cutting out, choosing to wait for daylight because it seemed responsible. Daylight had arrived too late. He shoved the memory down before it could take its usual shape. Not tonight, not now. The lioness blinked slowly, as if the simple movement cost her. Then she lowered her head, not in submission, not in threat, just heaviness, a body that had carried life too far, too long, with too little left to give. The wind shifted and snow swirled around her like a veil. She stayed planted at the threshold as if she'd already decided this was the last place she could stand. Ethan's hand tightened on the door edge. His lips parted. There was nothing sensible to say to a lion. Still, he whispered more to the space between them than to her. "What are you doing here?" She didn't answer, of course, but her eyes did something that unsettled him more than any roar could have. They held. Not pleading like a human, not calculating like a hunter, just holding like a creature at the end of options. Ethan's mind sprinted through procedure. Call wildlife response, call state officials, call anyone with a tranquilizer and a truck. He looked over his shoulder at the radio static. He glanced at the satellite phone, 2 bars of battery, but a storm thick enough to eat signals. And even if it connected, no one would climb this road tonight. Not in time, not safely. He faced the lioness again. Christmas Eve had never been holy to him, not anymore. But standing there with cold pressing in and a pregnant predator breathing on his doorstep, it felt like the kind of moment the world didn't repeat. Ethan made a choice that wasn't in any manual. He didn't fling the door wide. He didn't beckon. He simply stepped back. One step just enough to turn the threshold from a wall into a possibility. For a long beat, nothing happened. Wind hissed. Snow tapped the railing. The porch light trembled. Then the lioness moved. She gathered herself with a quiet effort that looked like pain held under control. She lifted one paw, placed it on the threshold, and crossed into the station with a slow dignity that made Ethan's breath snag. The room changed instantly. Warmth thickened. Air filled with wild fur and cold iron. Her body looked too large for the narrow space, like the outpost had suddenly become a child's toy. She took 2 steps, maybe 3, and then her legs buckled. She hit the floor with a heavy thump that felt like the building itself exhaling. Ethan stood frozen, door still in his hand, caught between the storm outside and the impossible reality inside. The lioness lay on her side, ribs heaving, eyes half open. Her breath scraped out of her throat like it had to climb uphill to leave her. Ethan's heart pounded so hard his vision pulsed. He should have been terrified. He was terrified. But underneath fear, something else moved, something older than training, older than caution. Recognition. This was what it looked like when a living being spent the last mile of strength just to reach a place where it might survive. Ethan closed the door slowly, not to trap her, but because cold was bleeding in, and if she truly had nothing left, the cold would finish what exhaustion started. The lock clicked. Outside, the storm kept moving as if nothing had changed. Inside, Ethan Mercer stared at a lioness on his floor and realized his Christmas Eve had just become something he would never be able to explain. He swallowed. "Okay," he said softly, as if speaking too loud might break the fragile truce that had formed without permission. "Okay, I see you." The lioness blinked once, and with a sound almost too small to belong to such power, she released a slow exhale. Then she went still. Ethan didn't move for several seconds. When he finally did, it was with careful intention, like a man stepping onto thin ice and committing to it anyway. He turned toward the supply cabinet. Because he had opened the door, and some choices once made didn't let you pretend you hadn't. "Okay, I see you." The words stayed in the air longer than they should have, hanging in the warm outpost like breath that refused to vanish. Ethan Mercer kept his movements small, not because smallness made him safe, but because he understood what suddenness did to frightened creatures, human or otherwise. The lioness lay on her side, ribs lifting and falling in uneven pulls. Her paws were slack, as if they'd forgotten what standing was supposed to feel like. A predator built for distance and dominance reduced to a heavy presence on a concrete floor. Ethan didn't kneel beside her head, not yet. He angled his body away and moved toward the supply cabinet with the caution of a man crossing thin ice. He opened it just enough to slip his hand in and retrieve the wildlife first aid pouch, the one meant for deer tangled in wire or elk with broken hooves. Not for this. There were no sections in the manuals titled "What to Do When a Pregnant Lioness Chooses Your Floor on Christmas Eve." He set the pouch on the table without the slap of urgency. The storm pressed against the building like a living thing, but inside the outpost the heater's soft hum felt suddenly fragile, like it might be startled into silence if he moved wrong. He turned back toward the lioness and studied her properly now, letting his eyes collect details the porch light had hidden. Snow melted into dark patches along her tawny coat. The fur on her flank was matted. Along her back leg, a raw scrape ran long and angry, swollen at the edges. Not fresh enough to pour blood, but ugly enough to tell a story of panic and distance and payment taken by rock or wire. And then there was the shape of her belly, low, heavy, moving slightly as if life inside shifted with each breath she fought for. Ethan swallowed. His instincts screamed for a phone, a report, a response team with tranquilizers and crates. He glanced at the radio static. He looked at the satellite phone on the shelf battery, blinking 2 bars, signal uncertain under this much weather. Even if he reached someone, nobody was climbing this road tonight. Not safely. Not in time. He exhaled and looked down at his hands. They were steady. They always looked steady when the stakes went high. Your body learned to behave even when your mind felt like it was slipping. Ethan had learned that the hard way. A different winter, a different storm. A family on a back road, their voice cracking through a weak signal. 2 adults, 2 kids, a truck wedged in a drift. Blankets, food, hope. He'd sat at a desk and looked at weather maps that warned in clean colors, wind rising visibility, falling temperatures, dropping into numbers that stopped being statistics and started being threat. His supervisor had asked without asking, "Do we send a team now or wait for first light?" Ethan had chosen first light. He told himself it was professional, responsible, safe. At sunrise, the line had gone quiet. They'd found the truck close enough that a team might have reached them if a team hadn't waited. After that, the mountains hadn't called him a villain. The paperwork hadn't called him careless. People had used words like unlucky and tragic. But Ethan had known the truth with the clean clarity of ice. He had chosen not to act, and someone else had paid for it. He blinked hard and pulled himself back into the room. Not tonight, not again. The Lioness shifted slightly, a low sound deep in her throat, not a growl, not a threat, something raw, pain held behind closed teeth. Her eyes opened just a fraction, then closed again, like seeing cost too much. Ethan moved to the sink and filled a shallow metal bowl with lukewarm water. He carried it back carefully, keeping his footsteps quiet, and set it down near her paws, close enough to offer, far enough not to crowd. She didn't drink. Not yet. He took a clean cloth from the pouch, then a small bottle of antiseptic meant for field use. Human grade, mostly. The kind of thing you used when you didn't have better options and you accepted that survival sometimes meant improvisation. Ethan crouched not beside her head, but off to the side where he could see the injured leg while keeping his face turned slightly away. A direct stare was a challenge in the wild. He didn't want to challenge anything. He spoke softly, not like a man giving commands, but like a man announcing himself. "Just cleaning," he murmured, "that's all." He wrung out the cloth and reached toward the wound. The moment the cloth touched fur, her muscles tightened. Ethan froze instantly. He didn't jerk away. He didn't push forward. He held still and let her decide what the contact meant. Her eyes opened, gold, tired, aware. She looked at him, not at his hands, not at the cloth, at him. Ethan felt something in his chest tighten so hard it almost hurt, because that look didn't feel like an animal look. It felt like recognition not of who he was, but of what he was in this moment. The keeper of warmth, the one with walls, the one who could make the next hours possible or impossible. Ethan lowered his gaze slightly, a small submission, not weakness, just a signal. "I'm not here to take anything." Then slowly he continued. He dabbed at the scrape, lifting melted snow and grime from raw edges. The Lioness didn't lunge. She didn't snarl. Her breath hitched once, then settled, as if she'd decided this pain was acceptable compared to what waited outside. Ethan worked in quiet increments. Rinse, blot, pause, never pressing too hard. The wound was ugly but not catastrophic. Infection would be the real enemy. Infection didn't need a blizzard to win. When he finished cleaning, he applied a thin layer of ointment and wrapped a loose bandage secure enough to protect, loose enough not to cut circulation. His fingers moved with a practiced care. In another life, competence had made him proud. Tonight, it made him humble. He leaned back on his heels and gave her space. Only then did the Lioness do something that made Ethan's breath catch harder than any roar could have. She lowered her head fully to the floor and closed her eyes. It wasn't collapse. It wasn't drug sleep. It was trust, simple, dangerous, offered without ceremony. "I will rest in your presence." Ethan sat back against the wall, legs folded awkwardly, letting the cold of the concrete creep into his jeans. He watched her breathing ease into something steadier, deeper. Outside, the storm kept working the world into silence. Inside, the outpost felt like it had been renamed without permission. Not a station, a sanctuary. Borrowed, temporary, unofficial. Ethan adjusted the heater slightly, not hotter, just steadier. Too much heat could dry the air too fast. Too little, and the cold would steal energy she didn't have to spare. Balance mattered. It always had. He placed an extra blanket near the wall, not touching her, just creating a pocket of warmth that wouldn't demand anything. Then he sat at the desk and opened the logbook again. The pencil hovered over the page. There were things you could write down, temperature, wind, visibility. And there were things you couldn't. Still, he wrote one line anyway, small and private, like a confession meant for no one. 2013. Unscheduled arrival. Situation ongoing. He set the pencil down and listened. The Lioness breathed slow now, deeper. the room rising and falling with her ribs. For a while, Ethan let himself believe that maybe this was all she needed: warmth, quiet time. Then he saw it, a subtle tightening along her flank that hadn't been there before. Her tail moved once, then stilled. One hind leg twitched like it was responding to something happening deeper inside her. Ethan's throat went dry. He'd seen labor signs in other animals during rescues. Not like this, not with this much risk attached, but he knew the language of bodies. The outpost wasn't just shelter anymore. It was a boundary. If she had come here to give birth, the hardest part of this night hadn't even started. The lioness let out a low sound, deep, involuntary, the kind of sound a body makes when it's doing work that cannot be stopped. Ethan dimmed the desk lamp until the room was lit mostly by the heater's glow. Not darkness, just softness. Space, quiet, predictability. That's what she needed. So he stayed present. He lowered himself to the floor again, back against the wall, far enough away that she didn't need to account for him, close enough that if something went catastrophically wrong, he could respond. Minutes stretched into something that didn't feel like minutes. Outside, the wind rose and fell like distant surf. Inside, the lioness's breathing filled the room with a rhythm older than any weather station. Another sound came, wetter, unmistakable. Ethan's heart thudded once hard. He leaned forward just enough to see without intruding. And he understood with a steady certainty that made his hands go cold. This night was moving forward now, with or without him. The sound came again, sharper this time, short cut off, pulled from somewhere deep in the lioness's chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was work. Ethan stayed where he was, back pressed to the wall, hands resting loosely on his knees. Every instinct he'd learned in years of training told him to do something, to intervene, to manage to take control before control was lost. He ignored it. Some moments weren't meant to be handled. They were meant to be survived. The lioness shifted, rolling more fully onto her side. Her claws scraped once against the concrete, a sound that sent a reflexive jolt through Ethan's spine before he forced himself still. Her breathing came faster now, shallow pulls followed by longer, trembling exhales. Another sound, lower roar, escaped her throat. Ethan swallowed hard. He'd helped animals give birth before. Deer caught in fencing. A cow that went down in a blizzard miles from the nearest ranch. Those situations had manuals, backup, hands-on solutions. This had none of that. This was a creature whose ancestors had given birth under open sky and stars, choosing this place not because it was ideal, but because everything else had failed her. The heater hummed. The storm hissed at the walls. The world narrowed to the rhythm of her breath. Then it happened. A slick, dark shape emerged, followed by a pause so long Ethan's chest locked around the air he was holding. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the lioness turned her head with sudden precision. All exhaustion vanished. She began to clean with quick, purposeful strokes, tongue rasping, breath steadying as instinct took over where strength had run out. The small shape twitched, once, then again. A thin, fragile sound cut through the room, high and uncertain, almost lost beneath the storm. Ethan's vision blurred. He hadn't realized he was holding his breath until his lungs burned, and he had to release it in a shaking exhale. Life. He pressed his shoulder into the wall, anchoring himself, refusing the urge to step closer. This wasn't his moment. It never had been. The lioness worked with quiet urgency, drawing the newborn closer, her massive body bending protectively around something impossibly small. The cub's movements were weak, but present, tiny paws flexing against her fur. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. In another life, he'd folded an ultrasound photo into his wallet. He'd stopped carrying it years ago because some memories didn't fade, they calcified. He opened his eyes again just as the lioness stilled. Then she tensed. Ethan recognized the signs before his mind caught up. There was another. He stayed seated, hands open, breath slow, as the process repeated faster this time, less strain, but no less gravity. A second cub slid into the world, smaller, quieter, but breathing. 2. Ethan leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes, overwhelmed not by fear, but by the sheer weight of the moment. In the dead of winter, in a place never meant for miracles, 2 new lives had arrived on a concrete floor. When he looked again, the lioness had drawn both cubs close. Her foreleg curved protectively around them. Her breathing slowed, exhaustion finally claiming its due, but her head stayed lifted. Her eyes swept the room once. They found Ethan. There was no threat in that look, no challenge, just awareness. Ethan met her gaze briefly, then lowered his eyes, not submission, not fear. Acknowledgement. "I won't interfere," he said softly, unsure if words mattered but needing to give them shape. "I promise." The lioness blinked once, then she lowered her head beside her cubs. The room changed, not suddenly, not dramatically. It settled like something long held had finally been allowed to rest. Ethan adjusted the heater by a fraction, careful not to shift the temperature too quickly. He placed one of the thermal blankets near the wall to help hold warmth in the corner, never touching them, never intruding. The outpost no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a boundary that had been respected. Hours passed in fragments. Ethan remained on the floor, his back against the wall legs stiff beneath him. His body ached, but he didn't shift. Every movement was a question, and he didn't want to ask the wrong one. The lioness's breathing deepened into a steady rhythm. The cubs made faint searching sounds as they pressed closer to her belly. Tiny, insistent noises. Life, learning how to ask for what it needed. Ethan watched without staring. He'd learned long ago that attention could be heavy. Outside, the storm kept the world away. Inside, warmth, breath, and trust held. Somewhere between the heater's hum and the cub's quiet sounds, Ethan understood something with a clarity that surprised him. The step he'd taken back at the door, the space he'd offered instead of control, had changed the course of more than one life tonight. And whatever consequences waited beyond the storm, there was no version of this night where he would regret that single, wordless choice. Ethan woke to quiet before he realized he had slept at all. It wasn't the sharp, instinctive waking he'd known most of his career, the kind that came with adrenaline and half-formed fear. This was slower, softer. His eyes opened to a dim gray light filtering through the frosted window, and for a moment his mind struggled to place him. Then memory settled in. The heater hummed low and steady. The fire had burned down to faint coals glowing like buried embers, and across the room, exactly where she had been when his eyes closed, the lioness lay curled around her cubs. Nothing had broken in the night. That realization carried weight. Ethan shifted carefully, joints stiff from the concrete floor. He moved inch by inch, testing how sound traveled. The lioness's ears flicked once at the whisper of movement, but her head didn't lift. The cubs slept, their bodies pressed close to her belly, dark shapes rising and falling in uneven rhythm. They looked impossibly small. One twitched in its sleep, a paw flexing and relaxing as if practicing a motion it didn't yet understand. Ethan watched, struck by how quickly the extraordinary became intimate when you lived inside it long enough. Morning arrived in degrees. The gray light sharpened, revealing the outpost as it always had been, scuffed floor. Utilitarian shelves, weather instruments bolted to the wall like silent witnesses. Nothing about the space had changed. Everything had. Ethan stood and stretched, slowly easing the ache from his back. He brewed coffee with deliberate care, grinding beans by hand instead of using the electric grinder. The smell filled the room, rich, grounding, ordinary. Coffee on Christmas morning, shared with a lion. He took his mug to the window, careful to keep his distance from the far corner of the room. Outside, the storm had finally loosened its grip. Snow still covered everything, but the wind had stilled, leaving the world hushed and pale. The road was gone, erased into a white slope. Trees bowed under ice, their branches etched in delicate lines. No one was coming today. The thought didn't frighten him. It felt like time, borrowed time, fragile and finite, but real. Ethan crossed to the desk and checked the instruments. Temperature holding, pressure steady. The storm cycle had broken. Conditions would improve slowly, but access wouldn't return for days. He glanced at the satellite phone, then deliberately turned away. Later, he gathered supplies with quiet efficiency. Fresh water, clean cloths, antibiotics, reserved for emergency wildlife intervention. He approached the lioness at an angle, announcing himself not with words but with the soft scrape of his boot on concrete. Her eyes opened as he entered her awareness. They were clearer now, sharper. Ethan stopped immediately and waited. For a long moment they measured each other without movement. Then she lowered her head again, tension easing from her shoulders. Permission not freely given, but given. He knelt at a respectful distance and inspected the bandage. The swelling had gone down slightly. The skin around the wound looked less angry. He didn't touch it. Observation was enough. He set down the water bowl. This time she drank. Slow, controlled. Pulls her tongue precise. When she finished, she nudged one cub closer and settled again, body forming a barrier that needed no explanation. The day unfolded in quiet tasks. Ethan cleaned the station, not because it needed it, but because order helped him think. He restacked firewood, rotated supplies, checked the generator. Each movement was measured, shaped by awareness of shared space. The cubs woke and nursed, then slept again. Their movements grew stronger with each cycle, their sounds less tentative. Once one wriggled free and rolled onto the blanket Ethan had placed near the wall. The lioness watched without intervening at first, allowing exploration to happen. Only when the cub stilled into uncertainty did she reach out and draw it back with a firm, careful pull. Ethan felt something soften behind his ribs. Sanctuary, he realized, wasn't safety guaranteed forever. It wasn't rescue or ownership. It was a pause, a place where harm was not allowed to continue for a little while longer. By midday, light filled the room enough to make it feel almost ordinary. Ethan ate sitting on the floor, his back to the wall, movements slow and visible. The lioness watched him eat, not with hunger but with awareness, measuring him the way he'd measured storms all his life. He met her gaze briefly, then looked away. "I'm still me, you're still you. This space remains what it is." As afternoon faded, the weight of decision pressed closer. The longer this continued, the greater the risk of infection, of complications, of discovery. He knew the protocols. He could already hear the voices that would ask questions with no clean answers. Why hadn't he reported it? Why had he waited? He had no response policy would accept, only truth. And truth often sounded like irresponsibility to those who hadn't lived inside the moment. As dusk crept back in, the lioness rose for the first time since the night before. Ethan froze. She stood slowly, testing her weight, favoring the injured leg, but holding. The cubs stirred beneath her, confused, and she adjusted carefully to keep them steady. She took a few measured steps, then circled once, mapping the space anew, before lying down closer to the door, her body positioned between the cubs and the outside. Ethan understood. Not leaving yet, but preparing. As darkness returned, it felt different than the night before. It no longer pressed against the walls with urgency. It settled like a heavy coat, muffling sound and narrowing the world to what existed inside the circle of warmth. Ethan took his place against the wall again, blanket around his shoulders, listening to a quiet he had once feared. It no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like an agreement being kept moment by moment, breath by breath. The second night arrived without ceremony. Darkness slipped back over the mountains, as if it had never left, settling around the outpost with a quieter confidence than before. The wind spoke lower now, less demanding, and the building no longer groaned under its weight. Whatever rage the storm had carried with it had been spent. Inside, the lioness lay on her side, eyes half-lidded, but alert. Her body curved around the cubs with a precision that left no doubt this was not exhaustion anymore. This was vigilance. Ethan moved as evening took hold, guided less by routine and more by instinct. He ate standing at the counter, a simple meal he barely tasted, careful not to introduce smells or sounds that might disturb the fragile calm. He washed his mug slowly, listening to the water run, aware that even ordinary noise carried weight in a room like this. The cubs had changed since morning in subtle but unmistakable ways. Their movements were no longer purely reflex. They rooted with intention now, tiny bodies pressing close, finding warmth and sustenance with growing certainty. Their sounds, soft, breathy murmurs, rose and fell in a rhythm that felt almost musical, a counterpoint to the heater's steady hum. Ethan watched from a distance, struck by how quickly life learned to insist on itself. The lioness's body still bore the marks of exhaustion, but strength had returned to the lines of her muscles. Each time one cub drifted too far, she drew it back with a gentle sweep of her paw, precise and unhurried. Nothing about her movement suggested weakness. What she carried now was focus. Ethan felt something loosen inside his chest. He had spent years around animals studying patterns respecting unpredictability. But this closeness, this shared space without intrusion, felt different. It felt like standing at the edge of something sacred, not because it was rare, but because it was usually unseen. Sometime after midnight, the sound changed. One of the cubs let out a sharper cry than before, thin, insistent, wrong, in a way that made Ethan's heart spike. The lioness lifted her head instantly, eyes wide, body tensing just enough to register concern. The cub struggled, paws kneading clumsily, breath hitching. Every instinct in Ethan screamed at him to move. He didn't. He forced his hands open, slow and deliberate, and stayed where he was. He watched the lioness respond the way only a mother could, nudging the cub closer, adjusting its position with careful pressure. She lowered her head and began to lick firm strokes along the cub's neck and face. Again. The sound softened. The cub found its rhythm, small chest rising and falling more evenly. Only then did Ethan realize his fists had been clenched so tight his nails bit into his palms. He let the tension drain away, understanding something that settled deeper than training ever had. Urgency was not usefulness. Presence was. The station creaked as temperatures dropped again. Ethan rose to add a log to the stove, moving with the same measured caution he'd practiced since the knock on the door. The fire caught slowly, flames licking up with a soft hiss, casting warmer light across the room. In that light, he noticed details he hadn't before. The faint scuff marks on the floor where the lioness had collapsed. The small, dark shapes of the cubs pressed together like punctuation marks in a sentence still being written. Ethan returned to his chair and sat. Time lost its edges. When he next became aware of the room sharpening again, it was because the lioness was watching him fully this time. Her head was raised. Her eyes were clear. The cubs slept soundly against her belly. She studied him, not reacting, not defending, deciding. Ethan held still, hands loose at his sides. Something passed between them then, not emotion in any human sense, but recognition. She knew where she was. She knew who he was in relation to this place. And she was choosing. After a long moment, the lioness lowered her head once more, resting it near the cubs. Her body relaxed into a deeper rest than she had allowed herself since arriving. Ethan felt a quiet certainty settle into him. She would stay the night, not because she was trapped, not because she was weak, but because for now this place was safe enough. Outside, the mountains lay under a hush that felt almost reverent. Inside, warmth and breath and life held steady against the cold. Ethan leaned his head back and closed his eyes, not to sleep deeply, but to rest in the awareness that something rare was unfolding, something that could not be rushed, claimed, or repeated. Life had arrived here uninvited, and against all expectation it had decided to remain. Ethan woke to the feeling of absence before he understood what it meant. The outpost was quieter than it had been since the knock, so quiet it felt exposed. Not empty, not wrong, just lighter. He opened his eyes to a pale morning stretched thin across the frosted window, the light clean and honest in a way winter mornings rarely were. The heater hummed. The stove ticked as it cooled. The room breathed. Across the floor, the lioness was standing. She'd risen without sound, her body angled toward the door. The cubs pressed close beneath her chest, confused but steady, their small shapes no longer lost against her bulk. She looked different now. Leaner, yes, but also stronger. The injured leg bore weight with care, but without hesitation. The storm had finished its work. The sanctuary had done its part. Ethan didn't move at first. He sat in the chair with the blanket still around his shoulders, hands resting open on his thighs. He knew this moment the way you know a weather front by the pressure change in your bones. This wasn't panic. This was preparation. The lioness turned her head just enough to look at him. Not searching, not asking, a glance that acknowledged a shared past without promising a future. Ethan stood slowly, keeping his movements visible, respectful. He didn't speak. Words had done their job already. He stepped back, not away aside. Space offered again. The lioness nudged one cub forward with her nose. The cub stumbled, steadied, took a few awkward steps on legs that were still negotiating with gravity. The second followed clumsier but determined, its tiny body learning the idea of distance. Ethan's throat tightened. Only then did he reach for the latch. When the door opened, cold rushed in, sharp, clean, uncompromising. The scent of snow and pine replaced the warmth the room had been holding. Morning air spilled across the floor like truth you couldn't soften. The lioness paused at the threshold. She tested the air breath, fogging once, twice. Her ears flicked, mapping the outside world. For a breathless second, Ethan wondered if she would turn back, if the borrowed sanctuary would ask for one more hour. She didn't. She stepped outside. The cubs followed, tumbling into the white, their small bodies nearly swallowed by the scale of the world waiting for them. She waited for them, patient, unhurried, guiding them down the shallow steps and into the drifted clearing beyond the porch. Then they were gone, not vanished, absorbed. The forest closed around them without sound, without drama, until the only evidence they had ever been there were faint impressions already filling with snow. Ethan stood in the doorway long after the cold seeped through his boots. When he finally closed the door, the click of the latch sounded louder than it should have. The outpost felt larger now, emptier, but not hollow. He moved through the room, slowly cleaning without urgency. He folded the blanket, washed the bowls, returned the supplies to their places. He didn't scrub the floor where the lioness had rested. Some marks were meant to fade on their own. By mid-morning, the radio crackled back to life. A dispatcher's voice filtered through routine and distant, asking about weather, road conditions, station status. Ethan answered in plain terms. Storm passed. Roads blocked. Station operational. Nothing unusual. The days that followed returned to pattern. Snow softened, then crusted. The road reopened. A supply truck arrived with fuel and mail, and a driver who noticed nothing beyond the coffee Ethan poured him. Life resumed its familiar shape, but Ethan didn't. He listened longer before responding. He waited an extra beat before making decisions that affected more than himself. He walked the land with a quieter step, reading signs not as data points, but as conversations already in progress. Weeks later, on a clear day when winter had loosened its grip just enough to show the bones of the mountains again, Ethan slipped on melt-slick rock during a routine patrol. The fall was fast. The pain was immediate. His radio cracked against stone and went silent. His ankle twisted beneath him with a sound that dropped his stomach. He lay there in the ravine, breath-sharp sky bright and indifferent overhead. He did everything right. He waited. He conserved energy. Hours passed. Light shifted. Cold crept back in. Then he heard it, a sound low, deliberate, patterned. A call. Ethan pushed himself upright and looked toward the ridge. There she stood. The lioness was leaner now, stronger. Her injured leg bore weight without favor. Behind her, two young shapes moved, no longer newborns, not yet the ghosts they would become. She didn't approach. She lifted her head and called again. Then she waited. Minutes later, human voices answered, rangers responding to reports of an unusual animal call near the ridge, reports too deliberate to ignore. They found Ethan as the light failed. As the stretcher lifted him away, he forced himself to look back. The lioness was gone, but the understanding remained. Some debts aren't repaid in kind. They're repaid in timing. Ethan woke to the steady beep of a monitor and the unfamiliar weight of clean sheets. For a moment his mind reached for the mountains out of habit. The cold, the rock, the blue slice of sky above the ravine. But instead it found white walls and the muted hum of a hospital corridor. His leg was wrapped and elevated, a dull ache pulsing beneath medication contained and manageable. Someone had done their job well. A nurse noticed his eyes open and smiled, told him he was lucky. A bad fracture, but clean. No internal damage. Found just in time. Ethan nodded, accepting the words without comment. Luck had never felt like the right word for what had happened out there. Later, a colleague stopped by, pulling up a chair with the ease of someone who had shared too many cold mornings and radio checks to bother with small talk. They joked about the fall, about how the rescue team had nearly ignored the call at first. Reports said some big animal kept calling from the ridge, his colleague said, shaking his head. Didn't make sense. But it was persistent, too deliberate to be nothing. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. When he was discharged weeks later, winter had loosened its grip for good. Snow retreated into shadows and crevices, leaving the land raw and familiar again. He returned to the outpost on crutches, the drive slow, the road rough but passable. The building appeared, as it always had, unchanged, unremarkable, waiting. Inside, the air was still. No warmth layered with breath this time, no small sounds pressing against the quiet. And yet the silence felt different. Not empty, not accusing, just complete. Ethan moved through the station, carefully reacquainting himself with the space, the desk, the stove, the wall where he had sat through the night listening to life unfold without touching it, the floor where the marks had finally faded, not scrubbed away, just worn down by time. Officially nothing had happened. His reports were clean. Weather documented, injury logged, rescue accounted for. There were no forms for a lioness seeking shelter, no boxes to check for debts repaid by the wild. That was fine. Some truths didn't need validation. In the weeks that followed, Ethan returned to his routines, but with differences only he would notice. He listened longer before speaking. He waited an extra beat before making decisions that affected more than himself. He walked the land with a quieter step, reading signs not as data points, but as conversations already in progress. One morning, not long after his cast came off, he found tracks near the edge of the clearing. 3 sets, one large, 2 smaller, their strides uneven, playful, learning the shape of the world. The tracks crossed softened snow and vanished into the trees without lingering. Ethan crouched and studied them. He didn't follow. He didn't record them. He let them be what they were. That night, as the sun slipped behind the mountains and the first stars appeared, Ethan brewed coffee and stood by the window. Somewhere far off, a sound carried faintly through the trees. Not a roar, not a warning. Just a low call that could have been the wind if you didn't know how to listen. Ethan raised his mug in a small private gesture. Not of thanks, not of farewell. Acknowledgement. The door behind him remained closed, solid, ordinary. But he understood now that some doors once opened with mercy never truly close again. They simply wait. This story reminds us that strength does not always come from intervention. Sometimes the most responsible choice is restraint, creating space, honoring boundaries, and allowing life to unfold without force. True compassion is often quiet. It lives in patience, in presence, and in the courage to act without needing control or recognition. When humans choose to listen rather than dominate to protect. Without possession, we rediscover our place within the natural world. In doing so, we not only help others survive, we repair parts of ourselves shaped by regret, fear, and loss.